Hello, this is Jim Cochran talking to Matthew Bersagel Brayley of Viterbo University about using LCL for class assignment.
I teach the Ethics in Medicine course, which is an upper level course at a university. About half of our students here are nursing students, so many of them cycle through that course as their philosophy requirement. A brief introduction to ethics, which they haven't had, and then we do case studies. And then I end with them doing a final reflection that makes use of the leading causes of life as a way of thinking about what we've been talking about in the class. And then this past fall and spring, I've had them intentionally reflect on where they saw the leading causes of life breaking into their own experience of COVID. So one of the things about our population, I think it's fairly typical of a lot of US student populations, is that many of them are certified nursing assistants in the care facilities, either here in town or back in their hometowns. And so a lot of their reflections end up talking about their experience providing care to elders in these care facilities during an incredibly intense time. The framework, I think, has been helpful for them, gives them some language to articulate some of the things they've experienced. Making them sort of pay attention to where they saw hope, certainly in these situations where they may be the only, one of the few care providers who sees this person since there were no visitors allowed and things like that. And so it's given them some language connection for sure, is when they talk a lot about, including their own lack of connection this past year with all the virtual learning and things and inability to go out, but also recognizing in their residence that how the lack of connection affected their health. So we talk a lot about the vaccine, of course, and without them being necessarily vaccine hesitant, they've been able to articulate, because of those experiences in those care facilities, just how much the social and psychological health of their residents has impacted their quality of life. And in many cases, they are quick to say that, without a sort of proof, that they believe that many of their residents died earlier than they would have because of lack of connection, lack of ability to, really kind of keep up some of those other aspects that give meaning and just coherence, making sense of it all. Many of them work on memory care, dementia units, and so trying to navigate that. So from a student perspective, I think the basic framework is simple enough that you can introduce it, give them some vocabulary to be able to make sense of it, and then begin applying it as a kind of lens to view their own work and their own lives. So that's why I find it very teachable that way. Those papers have really led me to think a lot about what we expect of these 18 to 24-year-olds in those care facilities. Many of them going to school full-time, working a bunch, and all of a sudden they're thrown into this situation where they are providing counseling, they're providing spiritual chaplaincy care informally because there's nobody else visiting them. So they're having these end-of-life conversations with these residents, and they're 20 years old, and they're dealing with their own anxieties and sort of existential questions about the pandemic. And so we are actually launching a research project this summer, interviewing CNAs, trying to get at some of how has their role changed, how do they understand some of their own questions that they have come up, to bring in the leading cause of life framework to, again, kind of help us think about some of the responses. They're broad enough categories that once you get the definition, they allow you to dive into other areas of thinking and other disciplines even. So where you can take something like hope and you can go theologically, you can go psychology, right? And you can draw in on a variety of frameworks from different disciplines. We're talking about agency. I use that often to then jump off into social determinants frameworks, which now more and more students are becoming familiar with in there. Well, my two favorite probably are actually coherence and intergenerativity, because I think they're not ones that students naturally gravitate towards, right? I think there's enough sort of popular literature on hope. Certainly connection is, maybe the most straightforward in that sense, that they have a kind of understanding. But when you introduce that notion of kind of those obligations forward and backwards with intergenerativity, I think that opens up some thinking for students, and it certainly allows you to tie it into other worldviews that have promoted that notion of our gratitude and debt to the past and a responsibility to the future. With the coherence one, partly because it sort of lends itself easily to some philosophical conversations and asking them to think about where they fit into these stories, and how much that matters to the way they sort of make sense of what's going on. So I find each of them a helpful and as a kind of jumping off point that allows different folks from different sort of backgrounds or careers or majors to really latch onto it. Right? So everyone can kind of come into the conversation. And so even in a class that has a lot of nursing students, you'll have psychology majors or someone who can sort of add to it and say, yeah, that makes sense to me because of what we're studying over here. And so it's generative that way, I guess. If we only focus sort of on that negative or that pathologies, that we miss most of what we think of as life. And so I think it's sort of shot through all the things I teach, but just in my own personal life, trying to figure out, right, how do I build a life around those kind of anchor concepts, that this isn't just something I teach as an academic subject, right? That it's the kind of thing, if you teach it, you hopefully practice it yourself and paying attention to those things in your own life. It's for me about an orientation towards, right, the kind of scholarship, if I believe that it can make a difference, that trying to focus on those projects, those people who are really moving beyond just critique. From the standpoint of the framework, there are people who really like it, and then there are people who just really resist it, and not necessarily because they don't like the ideas. I think there are two potential reasons. One is that it can float off right into more sort of theoretical language, but I think they're largely not aware of the ways in which it's also being attempting to being studied. Or they're just, right, they've got their theoretical framework they use and they don't want to have to, right, think about something else. Like they've been doing this for years and that's just fine. Or I guess what we struggled with is, okay, if we wanted to move this lacrosse community, right, what would that look like beyond introducing the language? And the hope is if the language was introduced to these healthcare leaders, that then they also bring it into their institutions. But it seems like there's this gap, right, between introducing the language and then actually helping people orient their institutions around that language in meaningful ways. So, and we still read the Paul Farmer biography, or whatever people's critiques might be. He does put in front of the students the question of, well, right, how do I take responsibility for all that's my own actions, but also including the ways in which I'm complicit in all these other systems.